The Sam Sorbo Show is brought to you in partnership by the Herzog Foundation.
Hi there and welcome. My guest for this episode is a national leader in education reform, challenging the status quo, defending parental rights, and exposing the failures of our school system. She's recognized for her powerful impact. She was actually invited by President Trump to the White House in honor of her work on behalf of our children and on behalf of education freedom. I'm so excited to welcome her to the show and have this conversation. So get ready. Here we go.
Sam Sorbo,
Sam, welcome back to the program.
I'm glad to welcome Sam Sorbo.
It's great to have you here.
All right, welcome back to the Sam Sorbo Show. My guest is a respected leader in the movement to transform education and restore parental authority in how we raise and teach our children. She's a senior fellow at Discovery Institute, where she directs the American Center for Transforming Education. She also serves with the Independent Women's Forum. Her voice has been featured on Fox News and in the Wall Street Journal, The Federalist, The Daily Wire, and Real Clear Education, and I'm sure many other places. She's got 20 years of experience, both as a teacher, as a school leader, as a national consultant. So she understands what's going on. Keri Ingraham, I want to welcome you to the program.
Thanks, Sam. Such a pleasure to join you today.
Yeah, I've been very excited to talk to you about everything that's going on with education. And of course, there really is no better place to start than what we're doing with the Department of Education currently. President Trump issued the executive order, and we have Linda McMahon now at the helm, and she seems quite bent on doing exactly what the president has asked her to do, which is dismantle the Department of Education. I personally am a little skeptical that that's going to change much. I think it will change student loans to a certain degree. What do you see happening next?
Well, I couldn't be more excited about this dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education because it has been a 45-year experiment that has been an utter disaster. In the 45 years that the U.S. Department has been in existence, student learning has not improved despite trillions of dollars spent. And federal funding is only 10% of K-12 education, but it heaps on like 90% of the rules, the regulations, the bureaucracy. So it's just not conducive. It's so burdensome to these states and to local educators to do what's best for their students, to provide meaningful, high quality education in math, science, reading, writing, reasoning. And so getting the federal government out of the way, block granting the money back to the states, or with other services, moving them to other federal agencies where it makes more sense is completely common sense. It's just one more example of what this president's doing to downsize government, empower local control, and that's going to give moms and dads a bigger voice in the education of their children, and that is desperately needed. It's also going to get out these radical ideologies that have been infiltrated in from the U.S. Department of Education to the states, and so getting rid of those is a great move.
How is it going to get rid of those? And then I want to step back and look at what we mean when we say block grants, because I have a feeling that the audience doesn't quite understand what that means.
Yes, great question. So, as one example, President Trump had only been in office 3 days, and under his direction, the U.S. Department of Education cut $2.5 million in DEI funding that was going to the states to promote that. And that's funding that could be used on basic academics for children. So that's one example. He also put immediately on permanent leave 60 full-time people at the U.S. Department of Education that were peddling DEI, over 200 pages of websites. So that's one example of moving that out, but getting the control to the states. So block granting the money means that the states will still receive that money, but it's not going to come with all these strings attached. It's not going to force them to use those resources that have these harmful ideologies, whether it's DEI, critical race theory, radical gender ideology, or an anti-American worldview. But it's going to let the states decide, what are we going to do with this 10% of our funding? And it's great leverage, because if the states go against any of these executive orders, or they say, we're not going to comply well, they risk losing that federal funding. And so the president has great leverage right now to incentivize states to get back to basic academics, get the nonsense out of the way. Because when parents send their kids to school, what they're wanting is their child to be great readers, thinkers, be able to do math, be prepared for life, not to be infiltrated with these ideologies and with politics during the school day.
But it's interesting because you say the block grants are basically at that point no strings attached, right?
Yes. So the strings that are coming right now are all these rules and regulations of exactly how they have to spend the funding. And that funding might have been associated with things like DEI. Well, now the states have the ability to actually use the funding where it's going to help kids in classrooms learn.
Right. So, but it's up to the states to figure out where best to use the funds. And if the states decide to use it for DEI, then the federal government steps in and says, well, then you don't get the money. So there are strings attached, right? I mean,
Well,
ultimately,
okay, so let me clarify on that. So the strings are not attached with the block grant money, but the president has issued other executive orders that impact K-12 education. So regardless of those funds, he is going to enforce that. And the lever he has to pull when we're seeing, some of these blue state governors or superintendents, as in my home state of Washington here, already say, we're going to defy the order of the president, which is
right,
now law in our country, then he can pull that lever. But the money is intended to be block granted where the states can use it. But when they go against those other executive orders, that's where they risk, losing federal funding.
right. That makes sense. In fact, in the state of Ohio, they just passed a law that the Ohio schools won't be teaching DEI or they will forfeit the state funds. And the Ohio schools are actually saying, okay, we're going to do it anyway. Where do you suppose they get the idea that they can just defy the law?
Well, a lot of it just goes back to history. So, looking during the Biden administration, there was not law and order across
Yeah,
anything in our country. And so, there's this mindset of, I don't have to do what you tell me to do.
that's
Well,
true.
we're in a new day. President Trump has brought in secretaries and leadership who, when there's a policy, when there's a law in our country, it will be enforced from the border all the way to K-12 education. And so there's just this mindset of disregard, I'm above the law, but those days are coming to an end.
Yeah. You've written that the Department of Education has spent over $3 trillion in its lifetime, right? It's only been around since the 70s. $3 trillion. What have we gotten for that money? Have we gotten anything, do you think, for the $3 trillion that department? And that's not the overall budget for the United States, right? That's just the Department of Education, which is roughly 10% of the overall budget, right?
Exactly. Yep, you're exactly right. That's what makes up that 3 trillion is that federal funding.
What have we
And
gotten for that money?
what we've gotten is a bunch of bureaucrats who sit in Washington, D.C. in a massive office building. And there's multiple actually, who just continue to push this paper, promote things that don't improve student learning. But when it comes to the actual results, what have we gotten? We have gotten our schools more radicalized. We've gotten them off mission, and student learning has only gone down. It has been an absolute failure, and we have to do something different because, Sam, I know that you saw those National Assessment of Educational Progress exam scores that came out in January. So, our nation's report card, 7 out of 10 children that attend public schools in our country cannot read on grade level, and 7 out of 10 can do math on grade level. So we cannot continue the course as it is and continue to fund the status quo. Change is needed, and that's what this president is doing.
And so your emphasis has been to return control to the states and to parents, right? How do you see that positively affecting educational outcomes?
Well, as a parent, and love your child best, and you're going to do what is going to be in the best interest of your child. And so we need parents to make decisions about their child, including the education, because no two children are alike. And so a different environment, different interests, gifts, abilities, motivation, as well as learning preparedness all factors into how students do in an academic and a learning environment. For some students, that will be home education. For others, it might be virtual. When I lived in Dallas, I led a virtual and a hybrid school. And that is very different than these remote Zoom sessions. Parents selected it, the curriculum was designed for it, the teachers were trained in it, and the learners did it because it was the best fit for their learning style. Maybe they needed to be able to go back and read their notes multiple times instead of just hearing a teacher lecture once. Virtual provided that. Maybe they were ready to move faster. So the ability to customize, that's great for a segment of kids. Same with home
What
education.
proportion of kids do you think is that really benefit from that customized learning experience?
There's so many avenues to customize. So online is one. We had a lot of elite athletes who were training, also students involved in theater, different things, as well as students that were battling long-term illness and disease, students in the hospital for cancer. And so it was this niche market of students where that was a great fit. But what we're seeing right now about the customization of education is through micro schools and home education where parents can tailor it to their students' interests, to their gifting. And when that child is not in a brick and mortar building, the time is just used so much more valuable, and so much more learning can take place. It also can be adapted outside of the classroom through hands-on learning, through different experiences. And so parents are desiring that, they're seeking that. And as a result, those numbers are growing. So, just as one example, before COVID, micro schools were almost non existent. People didn't know what those were. Well, now there's a couple million kids in our country who attend a micro school. So, micro school just means a small environment where sometimes there's a mixed group of kids based on age, not always. And sometimes these schools have specific emphasis, other times they don't. It might be an outdoor education focus or an arts focus or a STEM focus. And then sometimes they're not. But parents are able to find something outside of that traditional system that's going to better serve their child. And once they taste and see something different, they are not going back.
Yeah. So this is what we're seeing now is that parents are appreciating alternatives. And it's still small, right? It's still a very small percentage of the number of students that are in school overall, but they're seeing choice and competition effectively give them better options for their kids, right?
Well, they're finding that, this district public school that is failing their child academically is disheartening their child to even enjoy learning. Kids
Yeah.
don't want to go to school anymore. And so getting kids in these new environments, it's unlocking passion, excitement in their kids. And when the kids are engaged, their motivation goes up. And the research shows, when the students are engaged, they're motivated, their learning goes up. And
Yeah.
so it's a win. And parents,
Yeah,
like I
because
said, again,
kids are
aren't going
curious.
back.
They naturally want to learn, and it's only in school that they're told to sit down and shut up, and they start to get disgruntled about not being able to learn the things that they want to learn, right? I wonder if you can differentiate between the alternative schools and the general, government public schools with the unionization of teachers. Is that a distinction that sort of merits across the board?
Yeah, such a good question. I'm glad you asked that because during COVID, we saw families mass exit these public schools when parents had a front row seat through those remote Zoom sessions. They saw it was chaos. They saw that the academics wasn't at the quality it should be for their child's grade level. They also saw these political and radical agendas taking priority. And so parents who could exited the system, but it wasn't just parents, educators have exited the system. There was teachers during these school lockdowns who love kids and they knew that this was harmful to students' learning and they wanted to get back in the class
Well, the
with their
number
students, but they
the
couldn't.
right, and the number of teachers now and principals who homeschool their kids is amazing. Like, you take a page from their book because they were in the
Mhm.
system and they're like, "Yeah, but not for my kids. I'm not doing that for my kids." And some of them still work as teachers.
Yes,
Really?
some were able to make that work, based upon if there's another parent in the household, one can, maintain that position. But back to my point where, it wasn't just families who left these district public schools, the educators started to leave.
Mhm.
One of the reasons was not just that they wanted, to provide better academics for kids, but they saw I can have control over my professional growth, over my development, over my compensation, because they could be an outstanding teacher, but if they only have 2 years experience, they're on a stair step salary schedule that's ignoring their performance. It's ignoring how they're helping students learn and grow. Where a teacher down the hall might have 20 years, and so they're getting paid significantly more regardless of their performance. And these teachers were saying, enough is enough. I want to exit this public system, take control of the future of my career, and get back to doing why I got into this, which was to inspire kids, put a love of learning in them, and teach these core subjects, not these other topics.
Yeah, there are a lot of teachers out there like that who they got into teaching for all the right reasons, and the system has disappointed them, to say the least. We're gonna take a quick break, and when we come back, I'm gonna ask you about the January 29th executive order shutting down the Department of Education, and also the fear-mongering that's gone along with that, special needs children and stuff like that. And then we will move into the school choice movement because I know that you're a big proponent of that, and just have a review of the pros and cons of that movement. So stay with us. This is the Sam Sorbo Show. I'll be right back with my guest, Keri Ingraham. And yeah, stay tuned. Thanks for tuning into the Sam Sorbo Show. We are in a battle for our very nation, a nation that was founded on Christian principles and on the Bible. The Ten Commandments is the basis for our rule of law. But these days, when you go talk to people on the street, you'll find that most of them don't even know what rule of law means. And that's why I'm so proud to have Herzog Foundation as a sponsor of my show. I also love what they do because they seek for the benefit of Christian education throughout the nation. So Herzog Foundation is a wonderful partner for us here at the Sam Sorbo Show. Thanks for watching. Are you looking for quality homeschooling resources? Apologia offers top-notch curriculum for all ages. It's designed to inspire a love of learning and a strong foundation in faith. Head over to apologia.com and use code SORBO10 to get 10% off your next purchase. Equip your children with the best education tools and save today at Apologia, the trusted choice for homeschooling families. All right, welcome back to the program. I'm Sam Sorbo, and my guest is Keri Ingraham, and we are talking about all of the different shifts that are happening at the federal level regarding schools, but also at the local level now because of the effects of COVID and the way that families have changed in their views of schooling, and teachers also. We left off actually talking about some of the teachers who have abandoned the system that they feel has sort of perverted what they thought education should be. And they're just trying to get back to basics of the academics, God bless them. And so we talked a little bit about micro schools because microschooling seems to be sort of the newest, the most avant-garde form of education that people have adopted. I'm setting aside homeschool because microschooling is of course part of homeschooling in a sense. And it really is just, let's form a small community and get the education of our children done. And so it takes many, many different forms. It can have different focuses and it can look different ways. It can involve different age groups even. It's just the idea that it's micro of what was happening in the general population. And I tell you, I take a lot of encouragement from that because it shows a sense of entrepreneurship. It shows a sense of picking, lifting yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing, just to try to get this done. But we've had this executive order. President Trump wants to shut down the Department of Education. Of course, there's a lot that goes into shutting down a department. But there's been a lot of fear mongering, which you've written about. And so I want to ask you about that because there are a number of different attacks against the shutdown of the Department of Education, not least of which is special ed learning and student loans. So you can start with those two and allay some of the fears out there, or dispel some of the fears out there, and then talk about any of the other ones that you want.
Sure, glad to. Well, as you mentioned earlier, I just received an incredible honor from the President of the United States, being invited to the White House to see the unveiling and signing of this executive order to
What was
return
that like?
education back to the states. I don't
Was
know
that
if you've
not
had
amazing?
Absolutely amazing. I don't know if you've had the chance to be a guest at an event at the White House, but it was off the charts,
Yep.
first class in every way. As we were in the East Room, which is where it's the largest room in the White House, where many events take place, I had the opportunity to visit with the 9 governors also in attendance, just one by one. It was a small invite to this executive order signing, and getting to thank them for what they've done to empower parents in their state, to protect children, to help parental rights, ensure that those are protected and that those are prioritized. And so, governor by governor, just thanking them for what they're doing. Also got to visit with Governor Abbott, which was such a highlight among the others I spoke with. And looking at that governor and what he has done to relentlessly advance the protection of parental rights and education freedom in Texas was absolutely incredible. For over 2 to 3 years, this governor has just traveled the states, been on the front lines saying, we've got to allow options for moms and dads, because when only 3 out of 10 public schools are effectively educating a child, that is a death sentence to their future. And he knows that when parents have opportunities, they're going to select the best for their child.
Let
And
me
that's
ask
going
you
to
this.
benefit the state as well as these students.
What do you think is wrong with the schools that they are not teaching children? Because wholesale,
Mhm.
the schools are failing at their mandate, at their proposed uh, raison d'etre. The only reason that they're there, and they're completely failing that one thing. Why?
Well, what we've seen, is public charter schools, private schools, home education, all of those sectors outperform their students, outperform district public school students academically. And one of the reasons is because big government doesn't work. Private sector always does a better job and for less money. But the reason that public education is so off the rails today, the district public schools, is because this notion of equity has hijacked their mission of providing academic learning to children. And so, equity, you'll see it as you walk the halls of these public schools. It's in their mission statement, it's outside offices of administrators, it's posted in classrooms. It's this driving goal. And equity today is no longer about providing equal opportunity for students, but it's forcing uniform performance outcomes based on metrics of race and socioeconomic status. And so, what that does is it does not call students higher. It does not have high expectations, but it's dumbing down education in the name of equity. Let me give you just
How
one
long has that been
example.
going on, though? How
Yeah,
long
let
has
me
equity been a player on this playing field?
It has been growing and growing and overtaking, public education for years,
But
and
decades?
it's gotten worse. It's been there throughout. I would say, 2020, we had the George Floyd, kinda
Well, but
aftermath
then
of
what
that.
what
Equity w
predated that? Because the schools were failing before 2020. They were
Yes.
failing in 1970. Why were they failing in 1970? They weren't failing as badly in 1970, so there's been a slow decline.
Yes, it has been happening for decades. Now, equity is like that buzzword, that's been around. I'd really say like 2020 is when it really started being heavy
Yep.
in the public school, like everyday conversations, our goals, our mission. Principal newsletters are just constantly about equity.
Mhm.
Um, it is the word. Now, those themes were still there before, but I want to give you this example. Out in the state of Oregon in 2021, they got rid of a basic academic test to show that kids were ready to graduate
Oh, yeah.
and leave high school in the
Yeah.
name of equity. They said, It's systemic racism if our institution of K-12 education is going to require kids to take a math test, a reading test,
Yeah.
science,
So in the
history.
state of Oregon, you no longer need to know how to read or do math to graduate high school. Go figure.
Yeah. So they're just taking away these standards, and that in itself is a disservice to the kids. I mean, they're stealing their futures under this guise of like so-called, we're helping them, we're making everything fair and just. It
But
is
that
not
wasn't in
fair
the
and
schools in
just.
1970, was it?
Mhm.
Is that your argument? Is that the rush to equity has been in the schools since before 1970?
Well, I
Even though
wouldn't
we
say
didn't
it's.
call it equity? What else would we
Yeah, I
call it?
wouldn't say they call it equity. This might interest you. So, dating back to January 10, 1963, Congressman Sid Herlong read into the congressional record. So, this is documented that there are 45 goals of communism in America. That is read into the record. And he continued to say that how one of those goals and how communism should spread in America is through indoctrination of children in public schools and through the power of the teacher unions. So this is
Mhm,
in 63.
mhm,
Now, fast forward, we have gone through, we might call things different today, like equity, but it stems back to things like Marxism, socialism, communism. Today we're talking more critical race theory or social justice. But
right.
all of these ideas have been in public education, and that is capturing this mindset of we want people to know less because the government has more power. And
Mm.
so that's been an underlying theme. Why now it might be referred to more as this equity or keeping it fair. That theme is not new. And again, that was in 63.
So it's socialism.
Socialism, communism, just saying, like having an uneducated population is how the government maintains control over people.
So what I'm hearing is that the problem is government. The problem is that the government funds education. That's what I'm hearing, because the government's self-interest prevents it from making the population educated.
And I think I know where you're going with this. As government can't be the solution, I've heard you say before when government's created the problem. But the problem is government is funding a monopoly. It's requiring children to attend a specific public school based upon their zip code,
No, kids can
regardless
change
of what that
schools,
school is doing.
but
And
kids can
so
change schools.
not in all the states. There's open enrollment is growing, but several states have no open enrollment. So a student has to attend an exact assigned school, even if a school across town or across the street has space, has better
That's not
academics.
entirely true, though, because homeschooling is legal in every state. So every child does not actually have to attend school. You might be assigned the government school, but you don't have to attend the government school.
Well, that would definitely be a distinction. So if the parents have the opportunity, to have more than one parent in the home, to have a parent who can work from home,
Well,
a
if the child is
grandparent,
12 years old, the parent doesn't have to.
somebody who can maintain that. Depends how they're doing academically. Nothing can replace having somebody work with that child past age of 12, to guide them. Looking
Oh, I
back
don't
and
know. I don't know. Homeschoolers tend to be very self-taught as of the age of 12, 13, 14. They might need a little bit of supervision just to keep them on track and keep them off the Game Boy or whatever. But I know single parents who have homeschooled toddlers while working full time. So it's not that the parent has to be home per se. It's that the parent has to provide parental supervision. I have a woman who works for me. She started when her daughter was 8, and her daughter came to work with her every day. So it depends on the employer, and it depends on the parent and what they're willing to provide for the child. So, so there is universal right now. There's universal school choice. It's not necessarily government funded, but I have to go back to this idea that you want the government not to have a monopoly. But the solution of school choice or government funded school choice is for government to monopolize every private institution then, by that
I think
definition.
let's clarify. So, universal school choice is far from a reality in America. So, the situation you gave of like a parent could work and also educate a toddler, like these are one off situations. The vast majority of parents cannot be home Monday through Friday, 180 days a year to provide education for their children. We've got parents who even English isn't their first language. And so just for them to have the opportunity to have support from a brick and mortar school with that can not only help their child learn, it also can help the parent. And so the notion that, home education is for everyone or that everyone has the option to exit a public school, that is simply not fact. People are bound to these schools because they're not able to be physically present that many hours a day because they are working, they're single parents. And so we have
It
to
is a
empower
form of
parents.
slavery.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I agree. It's a form of slavery. The fact that you
Having
are
to
bound
work.
to the public schools, the government schools that's why my whole thing is emancipation, because people are and feel enslaved to their schools. But that doesn't actually, that's a distraction from the solution. And when the problem is that the government funding it is actually the origin, in a sense, of the socialist mentality, I don't know how you can make a case for more government funding for private institutions, which
Well,
is the escape from the government funded public institution.
let's clarify that. So in our country, until we can get rid of taxes where people are having to pay into this public education, that money is already there and it's based on the number of students. And so states get X amount of dollars from the federal government. They also get a portion from the state, which is the highest, as well as local. So all of that is taxpayer money. Now, let's talk about education freedom where it's empowered, where parents have the funding to actually make that a reality, to exit the public system if they're not able to do it on their own. That money does not go to that academic institution. So just a distinction, I was leading a private school during COVID, and the school said, we're not taking this PPE relief money from the government because we don't want any strings attached. Well, when the funding of that child that's already set aside by the state for their education goes to the parents through an education savings account, private school scholarships, or a tax credit. We're not against tax credits on other things like 501(c)(3s, people donating get a tax credit. When they get a portion of that money, what you're doing is you're giving less to government, you're giving it to parents to then put it in the free market. And that is the best way to break down that government control is letting people exit, taking those funds. Those funds are not in and of themselves going to bring more regulation on these private schools, on homeschooling, because regulation by the government has always been around. But again, the funding is going to the families. And so look at where homeschooling's under attack, private
Right,
school choice programs. It's in blue states like Illinois.
right.
It is not in red states who are implementing universal school choice. So I understand what you're saying, like government can bring more regulation, but the key distinction is it goes to moms and dads. And I just want to make this point because this is so important, is what we've seen is the left politicians, not parents. Universal school choice is a bipartisan support amongst voters and parents, but politicians who are of the Democratic Party who fight vigorously against school choice send their children more often than not to
Yeah,
these elite private schools. So what they say is school choice for me, but not for thee. If you can't afford it, too bad. And so like what we got to make sure is this home education community, private school community doesn't fall into that trap of buying into that lie the teacher union is funneling into homeschool parents to get them to say, I don't want any attack on my homeschooling, so we better stop offering an on ramp to others to have what I've had, which has been transformational in my child's life. It's changed the course of their future. It's been great for our family. We've got to say, okay, let's empower parents because it takes that money, gets it out of those government schools, gets it to moms and dads. And it's also an enormous savings to the state. So let's talk about Arizona really quick. So Governor Doug Ducey in July 2022 enacted universal school choice in Arizona into law. During that same time, public school spending across our country in 2022 went up by $4,000 per student. So some might claim, like Arizona private schools raised their tuition. Well, there was 200 billion of COVID relief money. Average that out by students, it went from 15,000 to 19,000 spending. Well, all of a sudden, parents in the fall of 2022 had 7,000 to $7,500 on their student. And so that school, when that child left, no longer got the 15,000, which then became 19,000. They lost that funding. Half of that funding went to the family to select an
Mhm.
alternative. They could homeschool with it, home education, private school, micro school, tutoring, therapies for students with special needs. And that other money, because so many people in Arizona immediately took advantage of the universal education savings accounts, there was a $2 billion surplus as a result in the Arizona state budget by the end of 2022. So it's
What happened to that
enormous
money?
savings for a state, but it takes the power of this big government, moves it to parents to allocate it, and free markets always does a better job
It's
of
true.
increasing quality while they drive down costs, but they also spur innovation. And I love what I'm seeing in these different education avenues where kids are learning because it's innovative. It's so different than
Right.
just boring kids to death.
What happened to the surplus? Where did that money go? Did it go back to the taxpayers?
Well, so in Arizona, let me give you the context there. So Governor Doug Ducey at the time, it was his last year in office, so he passed this. At the time, Katie Hobbs was a Secretary of State, and she tried everything in her power to reverse it. First to let it not pass, then to reverse it. Well, then she became the governor in January of 2023. Again, she tried to reverse it. But once parents have experienced education for their child outside of that district school, they will fight tooth and nail to maintain it. I mean, in your case, could you imagine after you had this incredible home education experience with your children, if you would be forced to lose that and send them back to district school? And so
Well, unfortunately, I think that's what's going to happen
she
because
couldn't get
in
the
the state of
support.
Florida, we have what they've enacted is the Florida PrEP and ESA. And unfortunately, the ESA turns every homeschooler, if you take the money, into a public school child. You don't have to attend public school, but you are now classified as a government schooled child, which means that you have to pass certain tests and there will be more regulations to follow. This is only the third year or this is the second year. They're going into the third year. So we'll see what the new stipulations are for year 3. But unfortunately, it does change the status of homeschoolers. And we see in the state of Illinois, you mentioned HB 2728, where they're trying to regulate homeschoolers. And that is to go along with the ESA funds, which will be the impetus for their justification for regulating home education, which they have to do because the home education community far exceeds the government schooled community in terms of just academics. But if you want to talk, the problem that I have is just because we're talking about academics doesn't mean we're fixing education, because you cannot teach a child academics without training in character. And there's no mention of training in character. Now, some of the schools do train in character. Some of the private schools, the private Christian schools in particular, do a lot to train in the character of the child. That's why they are so successful. So what you're proposing, in a sense, is that because the public schooled kids will be taken out of the public schools, they will sort of wither on the vine, and the private institutions will grow. But the more government money those private institutions get, whether it's from the government or via the parents, the government's going to have a say in where the parents spend the money. They must. They can't just give parents money unless they give them the tax break or something along those lines. And so in the state of Florida, I don't know if you know this, but it's perfectly legal to take your ESA funds to buy a flat screen TV. It's perfectly legal to buy your kids a great big beanbag. You can buy them year-long passes to Disney World. That's considered education. And I don't think that the average person sits back and says, yes, that's what school choice is about. I think those kids should all go to Disney World.
Okay, so much there I could touch on. Just to clarify, Illinois is no effort even close for any kind of school choice to move forward right now. And so that's not why their homeschool effort is there. It is because they are so anti-parent and so union controlled that they took away in 2023 a very small school choice program for the lowest of income students. So Illinois is not even on the radar. So this idea that homeschool regulation comes hand in hand with ESA is just not factual. That's not happening in these red states. So in Florida, as you talked about, there is universal school choice there. Now, homeschool children are not public school children. Now, yes, they may have to take standardized tests and parents might have to produce some information. But when it comes to the autonomy of what moms and dads can do every single day in their home, that is a far cry from a parent who has to send their child to a district public school where their child is there 6.5 to 7 hours a day learning something that is anti-American,
Oh,
Marxism,
absolutely.
socialism. So it's a little bit of a stretch to say that in Florida, a homeschool parent or a homeschool student is still a public school student. The other thing I would just say, like, we don't want the homeschool community to fall into this trap of being on a megaphone mouthpiece, just like those radical left Democrat politicians who send their kids to private school but don't want it for anyone else. We want the homeschool community to say, hey, if I'm that much afraid of this regulation, I just won't take the money. But I'm going to champion that your family would be empowered to have the education freedom that has been life giving to our family. Because what you gave your children, Sam, nothing compares. That is the greatest gift, not just the academics, but they had quality time with you every single day.
That's what I
So
wish for
that's
all children.
ideal. We've got to figure out, though, how to allow moms and dads who can't do that, who didn't have an intact marriage and had the funds of one, primary breadwinner to support that. We've got to figure out a way to break down government control, empower parents, and if they can't do home education, what can they do? A hybrid school, micro school, a private school to allow their child to learn a worldview that is not going to be detrimental to their heart and mind or low academics that are going to rob them of their future. And
Yeah,
so I am so grateful for universal school choice because it gets people what you've been able to provide to your children that they would never ever have
no, no,
otherwise.
it doesn't. No, no. Don't confuse universal school choice with what I did. What I did had nothing to do with universal school choice.
Well,
Mine
you were
was
able to
purely an
exit that
independent
public
decision.
system
I did
that
not
was
take any funds from the government in order to do it. In fact, it didn't cost me 7,000 or even 6,000 or 5,000 or 4,000 or $3,000 a year to educate my children. It had nothing to do with what the government is proposing that parents do with their kids. And I'm always fearful when the government tries to tell parents how best to do things for their families because the government is diametrically opposed, honestly, to the individual. That's the unfortunate, just the status quo is that our government is predisposed against the individual, even though it should be for the individual. So the idea that school choice empowers homeschoolers is faulty because it doesn't. What it does is it distracts potential homeschoolers to become more dependent on government than they already are. Because when you're waiting for that check to arrive, and I've seen it happen, I've seen people who run Christian schools so grateful that some of their parents don't have to wait for the state funds, that they are just hanging on by a thread while they wait for the government to come and rescue them. And they are a private Christian academy. That to me looks very, very dangerous because that is government control. And we can hide it behind the money going via the parents and the parents having control. But when you look at the parents having control and you inform people that parents having control means that they can use the money not for a new laptop, because that's not allowed in the state of Florida, not for a Chromebook for their child, no, but for a new flat screen TV for the house and Disney World tickets for the year, then people start to wake up and say, wait a minute, So school choice is really a different form of US aid, maybe? Oh, maybe the regulations aren't quite as strict as you think, and maybe things aren't quite as Pollyanna-ish as we would imagine. So this is still a debate that's happening. I love your viewpoint on it, and you raise a lot of really great points. And I do believe that there is the approach where it's the step in the right direction, where we are wresting a little bit of control away from the state, but at the cost of what has yet to be seen. And so we will see, because honestly, when it comes down to it, school choice still doesn't address why our schools are so abjectly failing. And they've been failing, as you as I both agree, they've been failing for decades. And it's because they don't understand what education really is. And that's the saddest part in all of this, is we are trying to fix a model that is a perversion of education. Ultimately, I have 3 questions that I like to ask all my guests. And so I'm going to shift over there because we're going long. And I love talking to you because you have a lot of really great answers. What's your education background, and do you use it in your career today?
Yeah, great question. And let me just wrap up where we were finishing is I
Okay.
want every parent to have what you had. And without the exit strategy, they're not going to be able to have that across the board. And so that's why I'm working so hard on education freedom, that we take away funding from these radical indoctrination centers that are failing children. We get it where parents can protect the heart and mind of their children and provide something different that you were able to do. And so that's why I'm passionate about it. As far as my background, I was blessed to be able to attend a school for K-12 thanks to my parents' tremendous sacrifice, where what I learned at school was aligned with what my parents were teaching me at home. I was not in conflict by competing worldviews. Go to school, listen and obey your teacher, but yet they'd have to try to undo, that learning, that worldview when I got home. So that was a tremendous gift in my life. Another reason why I want that for all parents to be able to do that for their child. So fast forward, then I went on to undergrad. I worked 8 years as a Christian school teacher, athletic coach, and after that time, realized I wanted to be able to take what I learned at that classroom level, working with students and families, and impact the school. So I earned a master's and a doctorate in education leadership. Went in and was a head of a private brick and mortar school. So I did that, and then I wanted to influence the field of education by saying, what if we don't just deliver education Monday through Friday in rows in these, classrooms designed the same way they were designed 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago,
100 years ago.
and customize it, have different delivery models
Mhm.
that can supplement homeschools, could be full time, could be hybrid, like this university model where the school, provides a curriculum, but the teachers have a large or the parents have a larger piece in teaching that at home on off
Mhm.
days. So all these different models, I got excited about that. So then I went on to study at Stanford University. I'd always been in education, undergrad, master's, doctorate. Then I went to Stanford to say, hey, let me get a different taste of this from their school of business and their school of engineering, looking at entrepreneurship and innovation and applying that to K-12 where it is desperately needed. So did that, started leading the virtual academy, the hybrid, and then before COVID hit, um, decided, there's some public policy work that I would really like to contribute to help move education forward on a national level in our country. And the Lord just provided an incredible opportunity to step into public policy in 2020. And so now I'm at 4.5 years of doing that at Discovery Institute. I'm a senior fellow there. I lead our American Center for Transforming Education. And then I'm also able to be a senior fellow at Independent Women's Forum. So across fronts, bringing in education freedom, spurring education innovation, education entrepreneurship. So developing new schools, new school models, supporting parents who want home education with different resources where they can
Right.
supplement things for their children, but also protecting parental rights. That's a passion of mine because nobody knows their children best than moms and dads. And we've got to make sure that they are the primary educator as well as the primary protector and decision maker of their child. but then not forgetting the public education system. And so continuing to reform traditional public education for all those children who remain there. So that's what I'm focused on, using my education every single day. And that's another reason why I really believe in the power of education. It sets a
Right.
trajectory of somebody's life.
What advice would you give your younger self of any age?
Yes. Without question, I would tell myself, don't compare yourself. Don't worry. If I wasn't the best at a sport in high school or school didn't come easy, I had to work extra hard to be able to compete on par with my peers. And that can be discouraging when you're, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. But just tell myself, if I was younger, hang in there. Like that hard work, you are learning right now a character quality that is going to transform your future adult life because you're having to work extra hard and because you're motivated and you're driven. So if I could go back, I would just put in some
Yep.
perspective of saying, don't be discouraged, don't give up. What you're learning today is going to, pay
Yep.
greater dividends than you can imagine.
Take the long view.
Yes.
What's the most urgent cultural shift that you see the need for in today's culture and society?
Yes, I would definitely say it's the family, and that intact family, so much of that comes from what those parents learn in their 13 years of seat time in K-12 that forms their worldview. George Barna has research that a worldview is largely formed by age 12 or 13 in an individual. And so I see the breakdown as a family going hand in hand with what our government, district public schools are teaching children. And then the cycle continues, and then their child goes there for 13 years. So even what moms and dads are doing at home is broken down because the school has control of that child's heart and mind for the vast majority of their time. I mean, I don't know if your listeners
You're
know,
like
but
totally singing my song right now.
you think about, so a child is in school Monday through Friday, 7.5 hours a day. For the time that they're awake, that's 45 to 50% of their awake hours
Yep.
every single day during the week. And so what parents try to do at home, that is really hard to combat, especially when you're placing that teacher and authority over them. And so I see so much of the breakdown of the home, which is, I think, the number one societal issue, comes from what those parents were taught as well as their children through this government run, teacher union controlled public education system in our country.
That's why we fight on the same side, Keri.
We are allies.
That's why.
We've got some different perspectives, but I'm so grateful for you, your
Minor
leadership on
difference of opinion,
education.
but yeah.
Really,
It's
what
great.
you've done, Sam, has been tremendous. You've been a champion for home education and you have impacted so many lives. So it's such an honor to join you. And I just thank you for the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on the Sam Sorbo Show. Keri Ingraham, we will put everything in the notes so you can subscribe and find her where we put her, where we list. Thank you so much for coming on the program. So that's it for me this time. This is the Sam Sorbo Show. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, leave me a comment and tell your friends. Send this around. We need to keep this conversation going. Thanks so much for joining me. Until then, speak truth, speak it boldly. We'll see you next time.
The views and opinions expressed in the Sam Sorbo Show are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of the Herzog Foundation.